Sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one who never raises his voice. Rain hammered the steel roof of the downtown subway terminal just after 9 p.m. as exhausted commuters pushed through the crowded station beneath flickering fluorescent lights and glowing advertisement screens. Wet boots scraped across the concrete floor. Train brakes screamed somewhere beneath the platform. A child cried near the ticket machines while distant sirens echoed through the streets above. Nobody noticed Officer Daniel Mercer at first, but people always noticed him eventually. 6'2", broad shoulders, sharp jaw, badge polished like a weapon under the station lights. Mercer walked through the terminal with the confidence of a man who believed the city belonged to him. His cold blue eyes scanned the crowd the same way a hunter scans a field. Suspicious, calculating, looking for someone to stop. And then he saw Elijah Brooks. Elijah stood near track 4 wearing a dark charcoal jacket damp from the rain, one hand holding a small black duffel bag while the other checked the time on a silver watch. He looked calm. Too calm, Mercer thought. A black man standing alone in a crowded station at night. Not rushing, not nervous, just watching the overhead monitors as if he was waiting for something important. Mercer slowed his pace immediately. His instincts kicked in before his reason ever could. Around them, the station buzzed with ordinary life. Teenagers laughed near the vending machines. A businessman argued quietly into his Bluetooth headset. A homeless veteran sat wrapped in an old army blanket beside the stairwell. But Mercer only saw Elijah. He stepped forward, boots striking hard against the wet tile. "You!" He barked loudly enough for nearby passengers to turn their heads. "Step away from the bag." Elijah looked up slowly. His expression didn't change. No fear. No panic. Just tired eyes and steady breathing. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked calmly. Mercer hated the calmness immediately. "Depends," Mercer replied. "You planning on telling me what you're doing standing around here watching people?" Several commuters slowed down now, sensing tension in the air. Phones quietly appeared in hands. Elijah glanced briefly toward the security cameras mounted above the station entrance before answering. "I'm waiting for a train." Mercer smirked coldly. "Funny. You don't look like someone waiting for a train." Elijah remained still. Rainwater dripped from the sleeve of his jacket onto the station floor. And what exactly does someone waiting for a train look like? The question landed harder than Mercer expected. A few people nearby exchanged uncomfortable looks. Mercer stepped closer, invading Elijah's space deliberately. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Set the bag down." Slowly. Elijah obeyed without argument. That should have made Mercer relax. Instead, it irritated him even more. There was something strange about this man. Most people became nervous under pressure. Most people talked too much. Elijah Brooks simply watched him with an unreadable expression that made Mercer feel like he was the one being observed. A train roared through the station without stopping, blasting warm air across the crowded platform. Nobody moved. Mercer pointed toward the ground. "Hands where I can see them." Elijah raised his hands calmly. Nearby, a teenage girl whispered to her friend, "Why is he stopping him?" Her friend didn't answer. Mercer circled Elijah slowly, eyes locked on the black duffel bag sitting near the yellow safety line. "You picked the wrong night to lie to me," Mercer muttered. Elijah finally looked directly into his eyes. Calm, steady, unshaken. Then he spoke in a voice so quiet Mercer almost didn't hear it over the rain and train noise. "Officer," he said softly, "you should be very careful about what happens next." For the first time that night, Mercer felt something shift in the air around him. Not fear. Not yet. But something close to it. The station seemed to grow quieter after Elijah spoke those words. Not because the train stopped or the rain outside disappeared, but because something invisible shifted beneath the noise. Officer Daniel Mercer felt it immediately, though he would never admit it out loud. Around them, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a cold electric hum that made every face look pale and tired. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling near the turnstiles into a yellow maintenance bucket. Somewhere across the platform, a jazz musician continued playing a slow saxophone melody that echoed through the underground terminal like a distant warning nobody wanted to hear. Mercer folded his arms tightly across his chest, trying to regain control of the moment. He had spent nearly 20 years wearing the uniform. He knew how people reacted when they were cornered. Some became angry. Some begged. Some ran. But Elijah Brooks did none of those things. He simply stood there with his hands visible, his breathing steady, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the station cameras mounted high above the crowded platform. That detail bothered Mercer more than anything else. "You think this is funny?" Mercer asked sharply. Elijah shook his head once. "No, officer." "Then stop acting like you know something I do not." Elijah did not answer immediately. A train announcement crackled through the overhead speakers. Southbound service delayed. Mechanical issues near Jackson Street. The distorted voice faded into static. People nearby pretended not to stare, but their attention stayed locked on the confrontation. A middle-aged woman slowly pulled her son closer to her side. Two college students whispered while recording discreetly with their phones. An elderly black man sitting near the newspaper stand watched silently with tired eyes that suggested he had seen scenes like this too many times before. Mercer noticed the phones. His jaw tightened. Public attention always complicated things. But backing down now would make him look weak. "Open the bag," he ordered. Elijah glanced briefly at the duffel bag resting beside the yellow platform line. "I would advise against touching anything inside it." Mercer let out a short laugh, filled with sarcasm. "Advise," he repeated. "You are not in a position to advise anybody." Elijah finally looked directly at him again. Calm, controlled, almost emotionless. "You keep saying that," he replied quietly. Mercer stepped closer until only inches separated them. "Listen carefully," he said in a low voice. "I do not know who you think you are, but people like you always make the same mistake. You think confidence makes you untouchable." The station lights flickered once overhead. For a brief second, the platform dimmed into shadow before returning to life. Elijah remained perfectly still. "And people like you," Elijah answered softly, "always assume they already know the whole story." The words hit Mercer harder than they should have. His face tightened instantly. Without another word, he crouched beside the duffel bag and reached for the zipper. Several people in the crowd leaned forward nervously. Even the saxophone music stopped. Elijah checked his watch again. 9:14 p.m. His expression did not change, but something in his posture sharpened slightly, as if an invisible clock had started counting down. Mercer noticed it. "Why do you keep checking the time?" he demanded. Elijah looked past him toward the tunnel entrance where distant headlights reflected faintly against the wet steel tracks. "Because," Elijah said quietly, "in about 6 minutes this station is going to become very uncomfortable for you." A cold silence spread through the platform. Mercer stared at him, confused for half a second before anger rushed back into his face. But somewhere deep beneath that anger, buried carefully under years of pride and authority, something unfamiliar had finally appeared. Doubt. Officer Daniel Mercer had spent most of his career believing fear was the fastest way to control a situation. Fear made people nervous. Fear made them explain themselves too quickly. Fear made them break. But standing under the harsh white lights of that subway platform, watching Elijah Brooks calmly adjust the sleeve of his rain-soaked jacket while dozens of strangers silently observed, Mercer realized something that unsettled him deeply. Elijah was not afraid of him. The realization spread through his chest like cold water. Around them, the station had transformed into something strange. The normal rhythm of the city no longer existed. Conversations faded into whispers. Footsteps slowed. Even the loud electronic advertisements flashing above the ticket booths seemed distant now, drowned beneath the heavy pressure hanging in the air. The crowd had grown larger during the last few minutes. Office workers carrying damp briefcases lingered near the stairwells instead of boarding trains. A delivery driver in a neon jacket stood beside a coffee cart pretending to check his phone while secretly recording everything. Near the back wall, a little black boy wearing a red hoodie stared openly at Mercer with confusion in his eyes. "Mom," the boy asked quietly, tugging his mother's sleeve. "Why is that officer talking to him like that?" The mother hesitated before answering. Her face tightened with discomfort. "Just stay close to me," she whispered softly. Mercer heard the question anyway. His jaw flexed hard. Public judgment irritated him almost as much as Elijah's calmness. He crouched beside the black duffel bag again and pulled the zipper halfway open despite Elijah's warning. The crowd leaned forward instinctively. Inside the bag sat several thick folders sealed in dark gray envelopes, a silver external hard drive, and a stack of printed photographs clipped neatly together. Mercer frowned immediately. The contents did not look criminal. They looked official. very official. He reached into the bag and grabbed one of the photographs. His expression changed the moment he saw it. The picture showed a police officer standing beside a patrol vehicle outside a convenience store late at night. Another photo showed the same officer speaking aggressively to a teenager during a traffic stop. Another showed officers gathered behind a warehouse near the riverfront. Surveillance images. Detailed, organized, intentional. Mercer flipped to the next photograph. His stomach tightened slightly. It was him. Officer Daniel Mercer standing outside a downtown courthouse 3 weeks earlier, speaking with another officer near an unmarked cruiser. The photo had been taken from a distance with remarkable clarity. Date, time, location, everything documented beneath the image in typed federal formatting. Mercer slowly looked back at Elijah. "What exactly is this?" he demanded. Elijah's face remained unreadable. "Evidence." The word landed heavily between them. Mercer stood up quickly, gripping the photograph tighter than he realized. "You have been following police officers?" "No," Elijah answered calmly. "I have been documenting behavior." A murmur spread quietly through the crowd. Mercer felt heat rise into his neck. "You think you can spy on law enforcement and stand here acting innocent?" Elijah glanced briefly at the phones pointed in their direction. "Interesting choice of words," he replied softly, "especially considering how many cameras are watching you right now." Mercer looked around suddenly. Phones. Security cameras. Faces staring back at him. The station no longer felt like his territory. It felt exposed. Vulnerable. For the first time all night, uncertainty slipped into his posture. Then a faint sound rolled through the tunnel beyond the platform. Deep. Rhythmic. Mechanical. Not a train. Mercer turned toward the darkness instinctively. The sound grew louder every second. Somewhere above the station, tires screeched against wet pavement. Elijah checked his watch again. 9:18 p.m. Then he looked directly at Mercer and spoke with the same calm voice that had haunted him since the beginning. "I told you," Elijah said quietly. "This is the part where things start moving fast." The atmosphere inside the station changed the moment the sound reached the platform. At first it was distant, buried beneath the rainstorm hammering the streets above and the metallic groan of trains moving through underground tunnels. But within seconds the noise became unmistakable. Engines. Multiple vehicles. Heavy tires cutting through wet pavement outside the terminal entrance. People near the stairwell began turning their heads toward the sound instinctively. Officer Daniel Mercer stood frozen for half a second, still gripping the surveillance photograph with his own face staring back at him beneath fluorescent station lights from weeks earlier. His confidence had not disappeared yet, but cracks were beginning to spread through it. Elijah Brooks noticed immediately. He remained calm beside the platform edge, one hand resting lightly near the black duffel bag, while commuters watched from every direction now. Nobody was pretending not to pay attention anymore. The entire station had become silent theater. Mercer shoved the photograph back into the folder aggressively. "You think this scares me?" he snapped loudly, trying to reclaim authority before the growing crowd. "You collect pictures, and suddenly you are some kind of federal investigator?" Elijah tilted his head slightly. "I never said I was an investigator." "Then what are you?" Mercer demanded. Elijah did not answer. Instead, his eyes drifted once more toward the security cameras mounted near the ceiling. Mercer followed his gaze this time. Tiny blinking red lights stared back at him from every corner of the terminal, recording everything, capturing every word, every reaction, every face. Somewhere near the coffee cart, someone's phone notification chimed loudly in the silence. A woman whispered, "Oh my God," while staring down at her screen. More phones appeared immediately afterward. Videos were already spreading online. Mercer could feel it happening around him in real time. His heartbeat began to thicken in his chest. He looked back toward Elijah sharply. "You planned this." Elijah finally spoke after several seconds. "No, officer," he said quietly. "I prepared for it." The answer hit harder than Mercer expected. A gust of cold air swept through the tunnel entrance as another train thundered past without stopping, rattling the platform beneath their feet. The overhead lights flickered again. For a brief moment, Elijah's face disappeared into shadow before returning beneath the harsh fluorescent glow. Calm, steady, untouched by the pressure consuming everyone else. Mercer suddenly became aware of how alone he looked standing there. No backup officers nearby, no friendly faces, just strangers watching carefully while the rainstorm outside intensified by the minute. Then the station doors upstairs burst open. Footsteps echoed rapidly from the stairwell. Heavy, organized, intentional. Every conversation in the terminal died instantly. A group of men and women wearing dark rain jackets descended toward the platform with disciplined precision. Not local police, not transit security. Their movements were too controlled, too focused. Mercer felt his stomach tighten as he noticed the small federal insignias clipped beneath their jackets. One of the agents, a tall black woman with silver-rimmed glasses and a long charcoal coat damp from the rain, scanned the platform before locking eyes directly with Elijah Brooks. Her expression changed immediately. Respect. Not surprise. Respect. She approached without hesitation. "Mr. Brooks," she said firmly. "Are you all right?" The station seemed to stop breathing. Mercer stared at Elijah in disbelief. Nearby passengers exchanged stunned looks. The teenage boy in the red hoodie lowered his phone slowly. Elijah gave a small nod. "I am fine." The woman's attention shifted toward Mercer. Her face hardened instantly. "Officer," she said coldly, "did you open federal evidence containers without authorization?" Mercer blinked once, caught completely off guard. "Federal?" he repeated. The woman glanced toward the black duffel bag beside Elijah. "You have exactly 30 seconds to explain why an active surveillance operation was interrupted tonight." Mercer looked back at Elijah again, but this time the calmness in Elijah's eyes no longer felt mysterious. It felt dangerous. And somewhere deep inside himself, Officer Daniel Mercer finally realized the terrifying truth. He had not stopped the wrong man by accident. He had stopped the one man in the station who already knew exactly how this night would end. The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm raging above the city. Nobody on the platform moved after the woman in the charcoal coat spoke the words "federal evidence." The station lights buzzed faintly overhead, while rainwater continued dripping from the ceiling into the yellow maintenance bucket near the turnstiles. Somewhere far down the tunnel, another train horn echoed like a warning carried through the dark. Officer Daniel Mercer stood motionless beside the open duffel bag, his breathing suddenly uneven. For the first time in years, he no longer felt like the person controlling the scene. The tall woman stepped forward slowly, her polished black shoes clicking against the wet tile floor. Two additional agents positioned themselves quietly near the stairwell entrances while another began speaking into a concealed earpiece. Their movements were calm but precise, the kind of discipline that only came from people trained to expect chaos without ever becoming part of it. Elijah Brooks remained exactly where he had been standing since the beginning. Calm, silent, watching everything unfold with the patience of a man who had already seen this moment play out in his mind long before anyone else realized it was coming. Mercer swallowed hard before finally speaking. "Nobody identified themselves," he said defensively. "I was conducting a lawful stop." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly behind her silver-rimmed glasses. A lawful stop does not include interfering with an active federal operation. Mercer immediately pointed toward the photographs and folders spread across the platform bench. Then maybe somebody should explain why he was carrying surveillance files in a public subway station. Elijah finally answered before the woman could speak. "Because corruption rarely hides in comfortable places." The sentence landed quietly, but every person nearby heard it. The crowd had grown larger now. Commuters stood shoulder to shoulder near the escalators, phones raised carefully while whispers traveled through the terminal like electricity. A transit worker near the vending machines removed his cap slowly, staring at Mercer with a look that no officer ever wanted to receive. Disappointment. The female agent turned toward Elijah respectfully. "The operation has already been compromised online," she informed him. "The footage is spreading faster than containment can stop it." Elijah nodded once, unsurprised. "How many views?" "Over 200,000 already," another agent answered while checking a tablet device. Mercer's stomach dropped. 200,000. In less than 10 minutes. The realization hit him harder than any accusation could have. This was no longer a private misunderstanding inside a subway station. This had become public judgment unfolding live in front of an entire city. Mercer looked around and suddenly noticed the faces watching him differently now. Earlier, they had watched with uncertainty, some with fear, some with curiosity. But now the expressions had changed. People were no longer questioning Elijah Brooks. They were questioning him. A young woman standing near the ticket machines lowered her phone for a moment and whispered softly to her friend. He never even raised his voice. Mercer heard that too. Every word now sounded amplified inside his head. Elijah slowly bent down and zipped the duffel bag closed with careful precision. You know what the hardest part about operations like this is? He asked quietly without looking up. Mercer did not answer. Elijah continued anyway. It is not finding misconduct. That part is easy. The station seemed to grow even quieter around him. The hard part, Elijah said, standing again, is convincing people to believe what they are already seeing with their own eyes. Mercer's face tightened instantly. You are trying to make me look racist because I stopped somebody suspicious? Elijah finally met his eyes directly. No, officer, he replied calmly. You did that yourself. The words hit with devastating simplicity. No yelling, no anger, just truth delivered quietly in front of hundreds of watching eyes. Then one of the federal agents received a message through her earpiece and looked immediately toward Elijah. Sir, she said carefully, Internal Affairs just arrived upstairs. A cold wave moved through Mercer's body. He looked toward the station entrance instinctively as distant footsteps once again echoed down the stairwell. This time, he knew exactly who was coming. And deep inside himself, beneath the collapsing weight of pride and authority, Daniel Mercer realized something terrifying. The investigation had never really been about evidence. It had been about exposure. The footsteps descending into the station carried a different kind of weight than the ones before. Not hurried, not aggressive, controlled, professional. The kind of footsteps that made experienced officers nervous long before a single word was spoken. Every head on the platform turned toward the stairwell as three figures emerged beneath the flickering fluorescent lights. Dark overcoats, leather folders, silver badges hanging from belt clips instead of chains. Around their necks. Internal Affairs. The energy inside the station shifted instantly. Officer Daniel Mercer felt it in the tightening of his chest before anyone even looked at him. Rainwater dripped from the hems of the investigators' coats as they moved through the crowd with calm authority. Nobody tried to stop them. Nobody spoke. The commuters lining the platform parted quietly, phones still raised while whispers floated through the terminal like smoke. Mercer suddenly became aware of how exposed he looked standing beside the opened federal evidence bag with hundreds of eyes fixed on him from every angle. The lead investigator, a gray-haired man named Richard Holloway, stopped several feet from Elijah Brooks before extending his hand respectfully. Mr. Brooks, he said, I apologize for the interruption to your operation. Mercer stared in disbelief. Elijah shook Holloway's hand calmly. You arrived faster than expected. Holloway glanced briefly toward the growing crowd. The internet accelerated things. A faint nervous laugh moved through a few people nearby. Mercer did not laugh. His pulse was hammering too loudly in his ears now. Holloway slowly turned toward him. The expression on his face was not angry. Somehow that made it worse. Officer Mercer, he said evenly. I need your badge number. Mercer blinked once. Excuse me. Your badge number, Holloway repeated calmly. Now. The station fell silent again. Mercer could feel every phone pointed directly at him. His mouth suddenly felt dry. This is ridiculous, he muttered. I was conducting a stop based on suspicious behavior. Holloway nodded slowly as if he had heard the same excuse too many times before. And at what point during this stop did you determine Mr. Brooks was dangerous? Mercer opened his mouth immediately, then hesitated. The answer sounded weaker now than it had 15 minutes earlier. He refused to identify himself. Elijah finally spoke again from beside the platform edge. You never asked for identification. The sentence hit Mercer like cold steel. Holloway's eyes narrowed slightly. Is that true? Mercer looked around instinctively, searching for support, but all he saw were strangers watching carefully beneath the harsh station lights. The little boy in the red hoodie still stood beside his mother near the escalator, staring silently at the officer who suddenly looked much smaller than before. Mercer cleared his throat. He was acting evasive. Holloway slowly opened a folder in his hands. According to station surveillance footage, he said calmly, Mr. Brooks complied with every instruction given to him. Mercer's stomach tightened hard. Surveillance footage. Of course. Every second had been recorded from multiple angles before thousands of people ever began posting videos online. There was no room left for interpretation anymore. Only evidence. Holloway continued, speaking with measured calm. What concerns us most is not the stop itself. It is the escalation, public humiliation, assumptions, improper handling of protected evidence. Mercer's face reddened instantly. So now I am the criminal? The question echoed through the station louder than he intended. Holloway studied him quietly for a moment before answering. No, officer, he said carefully. But tonight you reminded a lot of people why trust in this system keeps disappearing. The words cut deeper than Mercer expected because nobody around him disagreed. Not the crowd, not the federal agents, not even the transit officers standing farther down the platform avoiding eye contact completely. Elijah looked toward the dark subway tunnel as another gust of wind swept through the station. This was never supposed to become public, he said quietly. Holloway nodded. But maybe it needed to. Mercer looked at Elijah then. Really looked at him for the first time all night. Not as a suspect. Not as a threat. Just as a man standing calmly in the middle of humiliation he never deserved. And for the first time since putting on the uniform nearly 2 decades earlier, Daniel Mercer felt something he had spent most of his life avoiding. Shame. The rain outside intensified until it sounded like static pouring over the city. Water streamed down the station stairs in thin silver lines while emergency lights flashed faintly through the entrance above, painting the underground walls with pulses of red and blue. Nobody had boarded a train in nearly 20 minutes. The entire platform remained frozen around a moment that felt larger than a simple confrontation between a police officer and a civilian. Officer Daniel Mercer stood near the platform bench with his shoulders tense, his badge suddenly feeling heavier against his chest than it ever had before. Across from him, Elijah Brooks looked almost untouched by the pressure consuming everyone else. Calmness surrounded him the way authority once surrounded Mercer. Richard Holloway closed the folder in his hand slowly while internal affairs officers quietly documented the scene around them. One investigator photographed the opened evidence bag. Another collected witness statements from commuters still holding their phones. Every detail mattered now. Every second had become evidence. Mercer watched the process unfold with growing disbelief. So that is it, he asked bitterly. One misunderstanding, and suddenly my entire career is under investigation? Elijah looked at him carefully before answering. This did not begin tonight. Mercer's expression hardened immediately. You do not know anything about me. Elijah took a slow breath, glancing briefly toward the flickering tunnel lights before speaking again. Actually, he said quietly, I know more than you think. The station fell silent once more. Holloway did not interrupt. Neither did the federal agents surrounding the platform. They simply listened. Elijah bent down and carefully removed a thin gray file from the duffel bag. Rainwater from his sleeve dripped softly onto the floor beside his shoes. He opened the file with practiced precision and looked directly at Mercer. 3 civilian complaints in the last 18 months involving unnecessary escalation during stops, Elijah said calmly. 2 involved black teenagers. 1 involved an elderly veteran outside a grocery store in West Baltimore. Mercer's face immediately lost color. You ran my file? Elijah did not answer the question directly. None of the complaints led to disciplinary action, he continued. Body camera footage was unavailable in all 3 incidents due to technical malfunction. Several people in the crowd exchanged stunned looks. A transit employee near the escalator slowly lowered his head, as if the information hurt to hear out loud. Mercer pointed angrily toward the file. Those complaints were cleared. Legally cleared, Elijah corrected softly. Not morally understood. The sentence lingered heavily in the station air. Mercer opened his mouth to respond, but stopped himself. Somewhere deep inside, part of him already knew the truth behind those words. Elijah closed the file again carefully. This operation was not targeting one officer, he explained. It was studying patterns, behavior, escalation, bias hidden inside routine encounters. Holloway finally stepped beside Elijah and addressed the crowd for the first time. Mr. Brooks has spent 11 months working alongside federal oversight divisions documenting public interaction patterns inside multiple transit zones across the state. A murmur spread instantly across the platform. 11 months. Mercer stared at Elijah with growing disbelief. You were undercover? Elijah nodded once. Most people reveal themselves when they believe nobody important is watching. The words hit the station harder than any accusation that night. Phones continued recording from every angle now. Somewhere online, millions of strangers were probably watching the same realization spread across Mercer's face in real time. Elijah looked around at the crowd quietly before speaking again. "Tonight was never supposed to become a spectacle," he said. "But sometimes exposure happens naturally." The little boy in the red hoodie near the escalator looked up at his mother again. "So he was telling the truth the whole time?" The mother hesitated before answering softly. "Yes, baby. He was." Mercer heard that too. And somehow that simple sentence hurt more than the investigation itself. Because standing beneath those fluorescent station lights while strangers watched silently around him, Daniel Mercer finally understood the part nobody had prepared him for. The man he judged in seconds had spent nearly a year exposing a system that judged people exactly the same way. The station no longer felt like public transportation. It felt like judgment suspended beneath fluorescent lights and concrete ceilings while rain pounded the city above without mercy. Phones remained raised across the crowded platform as strangers documented every second of Officer Daniel Mercer's unraveling in complete silence. Nobody mocked him. Nobody shouted. Somehow that made the moment far worse. Humiliation carried quietly always lasted longer. Mercer stood motionless beside the platform bench, his face drained of confidence, while internal affairs investigators continued collecting evidence around him with calm efficiency. One officer photographed the surveillance files. Another quietly interviewed transit workers who had witnessed the confrontation from the beginning. Every movement felt clinical. Final. Elijah Brooks remained near the yellow platform line, his posture steady, his voice calm whenever someone addressed him. The chaos surrounding the station never seemed to touch him. Richard Holloway stepped forward again, holding a small digital tablet in one hand. Rainwater glistened across his coat, sleeves beneath the harsh station lights. "Officer Mercer," he said evenly, "effective immediately, your field authority is being suspended pending full review." The sentence echoed through the terminal like a door quietly closing forever. Mercer blinked hard. "Suspended?" he repeated under his breath. Holloway nodded once. "You will surrender your transit access credentials and service badge." A murmur spread softly through the crowd. Several commuters lowered their phones slightly, almost uncomfortable witnessing the moment unfold. Because this was no longer about punishment. It was about collapse. Mercer looked around helplessly as if searching for someone to defend him, but nobody moved. Not the transit officers farther down the platform. Not the commuters who had watched the confrontation escalate. Not even the younger patrolman who had arrived upstairs earlier and now stood near the station entrance staring silently at the floor. Mercer reached slowly toward the badge attached to his uniform. His hand trembled slightly. For 20 years that badge had protected him from doubt. From accountability. From ever having to truly examine the assumptions living quietly inside him. Now hundreds of strangers watched him remove it beneath flickering subway lights, while rainwater dripped steadily through the leaking ceiling nearby. Elijah observed silently without satisfaction on his face. No smile. No revenge. Only exhaustion. That unsettled Mercer more than anger ever could have. "You already got what you wanted," Mercer muttered bitterly while unclipping the badge. Elijah shook his head softly. "This was never about destroying you." Mercer laughed once, hollow and tired. "Could have fooled me." Elijah stepped slightly closer, his voice low enough that only those nearest could hear clearly. "If I wanted revenge," he said quietly, "I would have humiliated you the way people like me get humiliated every day." The words settled heavily into the station air. Mercer looked down immediately. Somewhere nearby, the little boy in the red hoodie slowly slipped his hand into his mother's while watching the scene unfold. A train finally arrived at the platform with a roar of steel and wind, but nobody rushed to board it. Nobody wanted to leave before the moment ended. Holloway accepted Mercer's badge carefully and placed it inside an evidence envelope without drama. No speeches. No shouting. Just procedure. That quiet professionalism somehow made everything feel even more permanent. One of the federal agents approached Elijah with an umbrella and a fresh coat after noticing the rainwater soaking through his jacket from earlier. Elijah thanked her politely before looking one last time toward Mercer. "The dangerous thing about power," Elijah said calmly, "is that eventually people stop questioning themselves." Mercer stared at him silently. Deep lines of regret had begun forming across his face beneath the station lights. For the first time all night, he looked older than his years. Holloway motioned toward the stairwell. "We are done here." Slowly the crowd began dispersing at last, conversations returning in hushed, uncertain voices while trains continued rolling through the underground tunnels beneath the storm. But even as commuters disappeared into the city, night, nobody would forget what they had witnessed inside that station. Because there had been no fight, no dramatic arrest, no explosion of anger, just truth arriving quietly enough to expose everything. By the time the station finally began returning to normal, the storm outside had already swallowed most of the city. Rain poured down the subway stairs in endless silver streams, while tired commuters disappeared one by one into the late-night darkness beyond the terminal entrance. The platform that had once been packed with tension now felt strangely hollow, as if the walls themselves were still processing everything they had witnessed. Train doors opened and closed with mechanical indifference. Announcements crackled overhead. Life continued moving forward, but not for everyone. Officer Daniel Mercer remained near the far end of the platform beneath a flickering fluorescent light, his empty uniform suddenly looking unfamiliar without the badge clipped to his chest. For years, that small piece of metal had shaped the way people looked at him, listened to him, feared him. Now strangers passed by without even recognizing him as authority anymore. The realization sat heavily across his face. A transit employee quietly removed the yellow caution cone near the leaking ceiling while federal investigators packed equipment into black cases nearby. Nobody rushed. Nobody celebrated. Even Elijah Brooks moved with quiet exhaustion instead of victory. He stood near the platform edge wearing the dry overcoat one of the agents had given him earlier, watching another train disappear into the dark tunnel ahead. Richard Holloway approached him slowly. "The department commissioner called twice already," he said quietly. Elijah nodded faintly, and Holloway looked back toward Mercer for a brief moment before answering. "They are preparing a public statement before morning." Elijah said nothing. Holloway studied him carefully. "You knew this operation would end careers eventually." Elijah's eyes stayed fixed on the empty tracks. "I hoped it would change behavior before it reached that point." The answer lingered quietly between them. Nearby, the little boy in the red hoodie passed Elijah while holding his mother's hand on the way toward the exit stairs. Before leaving, the child stopped for a moment and looked up at him. "Mister," he asked softly, "were you scared?" Elijah glanced down at the boy, surprised by the question. Then a small tired smile crossed his face for the first time all night. "Yes," he admitted gently. "But being scared does not mean you stop standing still." The boy nodded slowly as if trying to understand something much larger than himself before his mother guided him toward the stairs. Mercer watched the exchange from across the platform in complete silence. Something about it broke through whatever defenses he still had left. Because all night he had seen Elijah as suspicious, difficult, dangerous. But the crowd had seen something else entirely. Patience, control, dignity under pressure. Mercer lowered his eyes toward the wet subway floor. Somewhere deep inside himself, he finally understood that authority had blinded him so completely he had forgotten the difference between control and respect. Elijah picked up the black duffel bag carefully and started toward the departing federal agents waiting near the escalator. Just before reaching the stairs, he stopped and turned one last time toward Mercer. The station lights flickered softly above them while rain echoed faintly through the city overhead. "Officer," Elijah said calmly, "people do not remember power the way we think they do." Mercer looked up slowly. Elijah continued, "They remember how power made them feel. No anger, no cruelty, just truth spoken quietly enough to last." Mercer could not answer. He simply stood there beneath the fading fluorescent lights while Elijah disappeared up the station stairs and into the storm waiting above the city streets. The train platform eventually emptied completely after that. The phone stopped recording. The agents left. The trains kept moving through the tunnels beneath Baltimore like they always had. But somewhere online, millions of people were still watching the same moment unfold over and over again. A calm black man standing silently beneath subway lights while a system exposed itself without ever being forced to. Because in the end, the night was never really about one officer or one investigation. It was about what happens when truth stays calm long enough for the world to finally notice it. And somewhere beneath the endless sound of rain against concrete and steel, one painful realization remained behind like an echo that refused to disappear. He wore the badge believing it gave him power over others. But that night, power belonged to the man who never needed the badge at all.